The discussion of negative externalities in Lecture 12 focused on what happens when there's a willing buyer of a good and a willing seller of the good, but the production of the good had negative effects on an external third party, like pollution. The discussion of positive externalities in Lecture 13 focused on what happens when there's a willing buyer of a good and a willing seller of a good, but production of the good had positive effects on an external third party, like the invention of new technology. The subject of this lecture considers the case that economists call public goods, which can be thought of as an extreme example of a positive externality. In this situation, it becomes very difficult or even impossible for a seller to charge buyers for the cost of producing a good. Or to put it another way, a producer of a public good is likely to be giving away lots of positive externality benefits to lots of people who haven't paid for them. As a result, private markets are just not going to do a very good job of producing public goods. As we'll see, the discussion of public goods then opens up a deeper issue. Are there categories where rationally self-interested behavior by all participants can end up having undesirable effects? But let's start off here by pinning down in a more formal sense exactly what a public good is. A public good has two characteristics. It is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. Now, of course, I'm afraid this is the sort of definition that just creates the need for more definitions, but sometimes you can't quite help that. When we think about what's meant by non-rivalrous means that the good itself is not diminished as more people use it. An example would be something like national defense. Now let's think about a private good and a public good here. If you have a private good like pizza, if Max is eating pizza, then Michelle cannot also eat the pizza. The two people are rivals in consumption. One or the other of them gets it. But if you have a public good like national defense, one person, Max's consumption of national defense, does not reduce the amount left for Michelle. So they are non-rivalrous in their consumption of that good. If a new baby is born, you don't have to add more national defense to protect them. Non-excludable means a seller cannot exclude those who did not pay from using the good. Again, think about a private good like a slice of pizza. If you don't use that private good, that slice of pizza, you don't pay for it. And if you don't pay for it, you can be stopped from getting that private good. But now consider a public good like national defense. If someone doesn't wish to be protected by the armed forces, you can't really say, well, everyone else in the country is protected, but you don't have to be. I mean, it sort of covers you whether you want to be covered or not. If an extra baby is born, we don't use up a greater extent of national defense services because there's an extra person there. Now, let me give you some other examples of public goods. I talked about national defense already, but let's think about some other possibilities. And I should emphasize when I'm talking about public goods, some of these are not perfect public goods, in the sense that they are not perfectly non-rivalrous and perfectly non-excludable, but they still recognizably have these traits in a way that it will make it difficult for a private market to provide them. For example, let's think about education. Many of the benefits of education aren't just to the person who gets the education, but they're benefits to society as a whole. It's generally better to live in a society where people are educated, where workers are educated. Adding some population doesn't diminish the benefit of education. It's also a non-rivalrous. You don't exclude people from enjoying the general benefit of living among educated workers and educated citizens. The same can be said for public health, like the issue of whether people have infectious diseases. It's non-rivalrous because adding population doesn't diminish the benefit of reducing infectious diseases, and it's non-excludable. If you reduce infectious diseases, you can't say, well, we exclude you from enjoying not having any infectious diseases around. Having a good system of transportation gives all kinds of benefits. My benefit from having roads typically doesn't come at your expense except in the case of highway congestion. It's hard to exclude people from using the transportation system, although we do have some toll roads out there. Scientific research and basic knowledge can be considered a public good as well. It's non-rivalrous in the sense that adding more population doesn't diminish the benefit of living in a society with good knowledge and good technology. And you can't really exclude people from the benefits of new technology if they're living in the society. Thomas Jefferson actually expressed the notion that many ideas are non-rivalrous and perhaps non-excludable as well in elegant language. Jefferson once said, "If nature has made any one thing less susceptible than all others of exclusive property, it is the action of the thinking power called an idea. No one possesses the less because every other possesses the whole of it. He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine, as he who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me." A free rider problem, as economists call it, emerges when some people can receive benefits from public goods without a need to pay their fair share of the costs. And the useful metaphor here for thinking about why it's called a free rider comes up if you ask people to pay for roads. Imagine that you surveyed people individually and you said, "I'd like you to pay for your road, just like you pay for your pizza or your groceries." A lot of people would, at least implicitly, reason as follows. Why should I offer to pay for a road? I mean, after all, whether I pay for the road or don't pay for the road won't make much difference to whether the road is actually built. And no one can really stop me from using the road, at least if we're talking about local roads going here and there. So what most people would actually prefer if they were guided by their own narrow self-interest would be everyone else should chip in and pay for the road while I act as a free rider. I ride on the road without paying for it. But of course, if everyone reasons this way, I won't pay, I'll just let everyone else pay for the road, then eventually the road won't be built at all. The public service won't be provided at all. Now, because of this intertwined pattern of goods with non-rivalrous and non-excludable characteristics, and the possibility that goods with non-excludable, non-rivalrous characteristics will have lots of free riders, essentially, a public good is an extreme example of a positive externality. Remember that with a positive externality, an inventor got only part of the return from the invention. With a public good, however, an inventor really can't get anyone to pay because they can't exclude people from using it. And moreover, in an economic sense, people could say, hey, when I use it, I'm not really imposing any cost on anyone else by consuming the good because it's a non-rivalrous good. So I'm not really taking from anyone else when I use the public good. So someone who's thinking about building a public good or inventing a public good has to fear that they could end up with a return of almost zero. Kind of like when Thomas Edison was inventing that automatic voting machine we talked about in the previous lecture. So, how can we get public goods provided? Before talking about how societies might address this problem of getting people to pay for public goods, we need to take a little intellectual detour. Because it turns out that public goods are a manifestation of a broader situation, where people act in their own rational self-interest, like a free rider does, with the result that everyone ends up worse off. And I want to illustrate the situation with a famous problem in game theory that's called the prisoner's dilemma. Now, at this point, you've probably noticed that economists like to take a complex situation like a market and break it down into pieces like demand and supply that can be analyzed one piece at a time. The prisoner's dilemma is a classic example in game theory of how, when all parties pursue their own rational self-interest, it can make all of them worse off rather than better off. Most game theory problems have a sort of story behind them. So let me tell you the story of the prisoner's dilemma. Two guys commit a crime together. They're taken to the police station, and they're split up into separate rooms. The police come into the first guy's room, and they say something like this. You know, your buddy is confessing in the next room. He's only going to get 1 year because he's confessing and cooperating with us, helping us out. You're going to get 8 years because you're stuck. So why don't you confess too? If you confess too, we'll just give you 5 years. And we've got you already. Of course, at the same time, they're going over to the other guy's room and saying, oh, why don't you confess? Because, the guy next door is confessing, and you're about to be on the hook for 8 years, but we'll offer you a special deal. If you confess, we'll only cut it down to 5 years. Now, that sort of deal might be quite successful in pressuring both criminals to confess. But what if the criminal says, how do I know you're telling the truth? How do I know the guy in the next room really is confessing? Well, the police might answer in this way, and now our criminal has to be presumed to be a little sophisticated, but the police might say, okay, you can't really know whether we're telling the truth. But think of it this way. If your partner next door is confessing, you're going to get 8 years if you don't confess and 5 years if you do. So, you ought to confess. You'll be better off if you confess. If we're lying to you, and the guy isn't confessing next door, then if you shut up, you might get only 2 years. But we'll make a deal with you. If he isn't confessing and you do, we'll give you a special break, and you only get 1 year in prison. So either way, you win. If he confesses, you're better off confessing, so you don't get stuck with a big punishment. If he's not confessing, you're still better off confessing, because we'll give you some time off. And of course, they can say this to both prisoners at the same time. Now, this prisoner's dilemma game, as I've described it here with these particular examples and these particular numbers, has 4 possible outcomes. One outcome is neither party confesses, and they both end up with 2 years. And there's a total of 4 years of jail time for the 2 guys. The second and the third outcomes are one prisoner confesses and the other one doesn't. I mean, it could be prisoner A confesses and prisoner B doesn't, or prisoner B confesses and prisoner A doesn't, in which case the confessor gets 1 year and the non-confessor is stuck with 8 years. So between the two of them, they serve a total of 9 years of jail time. And the fourth outcome is they both confess. They both end up with 5 years for a total of 10 years of jail time. Those are the 4 possible outcomes of the situation I described. Now, in effect, the threat of getting stuck without outcome where the other guy confesses and you don't, combined with the promise that if the other guy doesn't confess and if you do, you'll get light treatment, pushes both players to a situation where everyone confesses. But if everyone confesses, the result is the total jail time is 10 years, 5 for each person. And that's the worst outcome of all. The analytical structure of the prisoner's dilemma is that if the two of them could cooperate and remain silent, they'll both be better off. But given the structure of the game and how they're separated, each individual has an incentive not to cooperate and to confess. And if they both follow this incentive, they both end up worse off. Now, there's an obvious objection to this prisoner's dilemma game, which perhaps can be phrased as, who the heck are you kidding? If the prisoner confesses, he's going to get killed, perhaps in prison, so he's not going to confess. Now, this may be true, but it just opens up, in terms of the prisoner's dilemma game, a broader question. If the players in the prisoner's dilemma game are separated from each other, how can they trust the other person? How can they believe that it's good for them to cooperate no matter what? How can they get away from this situation where they're being pressured to confess? The basic answer is that the players need to believe that the trade-offs of the prisoner's dilemma game are not all there is. For example, if they say, well, however many years in prison you're giving me, I know I'm going to get beat up or perhaps killed in prison. I'm going to face future retaliation. Then that might pressure them to cooperate now and remain silent. Or if they know that I'm going to be a criminal all my life, I'm going to be in this situation over and over and over again. And so if I'm going to be a criminal all my life, I know it's better for me just to shut up, because if I have a reputation for being someone who talks, I can't be a criminal anymore. So if the game is repeated, or if there are external penalties in the game, then the players may be able to get to a situation where they can cooperate. Now, the free rider problem we talked about before, in terms of building a public good, is actually almost exactly like, well, it is exactly like, in a mathematical sense, a prisoner's dilemma game. Let me try and describe why. Imagine that in the public good game, there are two players, and they're each deciding whether or not to invest in a public good. Each player has to decide whether to cooperate, which in this case means making a contribution to the public good, or not to cooperate, which would be not making the contribution. And mathematically, this situation is actually identical to a prisoner's dilemma game. So instead of two prisoners, let's just think about people thinking about making this contribution to the public good. Let's say that the two people are called Rachel and Samuel, just to make this concrete. And let's say that when either of them contributes to a public good, like we could call it the local fire department or something like that, the personal cost of their contribution is 4, and the social benefit of the contribution is 6. So the investment is a good idea for society as a whole. If they each invest 4 in the public good, society will benefit 6. But here's the problem. The problem is that while Rachel and Samuel pay the entire cost of their personal contribution to the public good, they only receive half of the benefit of their contribution to the public good, because the benefit of a public good is divided equally among all the members of society. So, in this numerical example, Rachel says to herself, look, if I contribute 4 to the public good, there's a social benefit of 6, but I only get 3 of that benefit. I only get half of the social benefit. And Samuel's the one who gets the other 3. So if Rachel just looks at her own personal situation, she says, why should I contribute 4 to the public good if I'm only getting 3 benefit? Samuel makes the same logic. Now, of course, if they both contribute, they both benefit the other person and receive benefits from the other person, and they're both better off. But from an individual point of view, it doesn't make sense for them individually just looking at their private payments and private returns to contribute. Now again, this game has 4 possible outcomes, just like the prisoner's dilemma game I said before. One possible outcome is that neither person contributes. They don't invest anything in the public good, they don't get anything, they both end up with 0. Another possibility is they both contribute to the public good. They each put in their contribution of 4, so they invest a total of 8, and they get a social benefit of 12. When they divide that up, they each get a benefit of 6, and so they each come out ahead by 2. And then the last 2 options would be one of them contributes and one of them doesn't. In that case, the person who contributed to the public good loses, because that contributor put in a cost of 4, but only gets half of the benefit of 6. They get 3. And the non-contributor, the free rider, didn't put in anything, but gets a benefit of 3 anyway. So the difficulty with a prisoner's dilemma arises because as each person thinks through their personal strategic choices, they're not thinking about how things benefit society as a whole or what would happen if everyone participated. They're just thinking about the outcome for themselves. Rachel reasons in this way. If Samuel doesn't contribute to the public good, I'd be a fool to contribute because, I'll just suffer. But if Samuel does contribute to the public good, then I can come out ahead by not contributing. So either way, I should choose not to contribute and just hope that I can be a free rider who uses the public good that's paid for by Samuel. And Samuel reasons the same way about Rachel. And when both people reason in that way, the public good never gets built. There's no movement toward the option where everyone is cooperating, the option that's best for all parties. In fact, this free rider problem becomes even more obvious if the concept of a public good is expanded to include many people, not just 2 people, as in this example. For example, say that 10,000 people are asked to pay $100 in taxes to finance a new road. Each person might reason as follows. Look, this new road costs me personally $100, but the actual benefit from the $100 I pay is divided up by all 10,000 people using the road. So my personal $100 only brings me 1 cent in benefits. That is, it's the $100 divided by the 10,000 users. If I act as a free rider and I refuse to contribute to the road will still be built. My $100 isn't going to make any difference. I can still drive on the road because it's a public good. It's non-excludable and non-rivalrous. and I can save my $100 for something I want to buy for myself. But if everyone reasons this way, if everyone tries to act as a free rider, then no money gets collected and the road never gets built in the first place, and the social benefits are lost. This idea of a prisoner's dilemma game, where both parties benefit from cooperation, but everyone has an individual incentive not to cooperate, arises in many different settings. For example, in the oligopolistic cartels we were talking about in earlier lectures, every firm has an incentive to increase its own profits by expanding its output. But all firms in the cartel will be better off if they cooperate to hold their output down and act like a joint monopoly so they can earn high profits. The participants in a cartel are in effect just like the criminals in a prisoner's dilemma. If they can all act together and cooperate, they can act like a monopoly and make high monopoly profits and divide them up. But each member of the cartel can reason as follows. If the other firms don't cooperate and start producing more, then I'd be a fool to cooperate and hold down my own output. If the other firms do cooperate and hold down output, then I can make more money by expanding my own production. So in either case, I should expand my own production. If everyone follows that logic, however, the cartel collapses and the oligopolistic firms start competing with each other. An arms race is another situation in which no country has an incentive to cut back on its own, but all countries could be better off if all countries cooperated in cutting back. Again, the formal logic here is identical. Each country reasons, if other countries don't cut back on their arms buildup, I'd be a fool to cut back, because I'd fall way behind, so I better build more arms. On the other hand, if other countries do cut back, I can gain a military advantage by building more arms, so I'd better build more arms. And if all countries do this, they're all fighting to stay ahead, and there's an arms race, where everyone would benefit from cooperating to avoid the arms race, but no individual can step aside, no individual nation. A final example is the example of conspicuous consumption. Buying a bigger car, owning a bigger house, owning the newest thing compared to everyone else. That can be a situation in which no household or individual quite dares to cut back on their own because of social pressure. But everyone would be better off if everyone could cooperate on cutting back. Some social critics, some of them economists, have argued that many people have an arms race mentality about conspicuous consumption. And again, the logic is just the same. If other people don't cut back on their conspicuous consumption, I'll look ridiculous if I cut back, so I'd better continue on my conspicuous consumption. If other people do cut back on their conspicuous consumption, then I'll look really cool if I keep up with my own conspicuous consumption. So in either case, I should continue my conspicuous consumption, and everyone continues on. And I guess, one more example, just because I'm feeling on a roll. The overuse of natural resources can also be a case where no individual has an incentive to cut back on their own, but everyone might be better off if everyone cooperated in cutting back. One more time, everybody reasons. If no one else cuts back on their use of natural resources, I'd be a fool to suffer the costs of cutting back. Me individually cutting back doesn't make any difference. If everyone else cuts back on their use of natural resources, they'll save the environment, and I'd be a fool to suffer the costs of cutting back myself. So I'll just free ride on their efforts. Now, this list of applications of the prisoner's dilemma game theory isn't meant to be exhaustive. The point is to emphasize that this prisoner's dilemma is really of great importance to economic analysis, since it indicates that there's a fundamental situation in which the pursuit of self-interest by each individual party leads to outcomes that no one would ultimately desire if only everyone could find a way to cooperate. A standard argument in economics, which I've been emphasizing in these lectures, is that if producers and consumers follow their own self-interest, the result can be highly beneficial for society. But in a prisoner's dilemma situation with free riders, if everyone follows their own self-interest, the result is actually worse for everyone. In the public good game, everyone choosing to be a free rider makes everyone worse off. So, society faces the problem. How can public goods be provided? There are a variety of social mechanisms that can help solve the public good problem. Let's start off with sort of what happens when non-government institutions want you to contribute to a public good. So, for example, public radio is a public good. It's non-rivalrous in the sense that if I listen to public radio, that doesn't stop you from listening to it. And it's non-excludable in the sense that if somebody's got a radio, you can't stop them from picking up the signal. So, how do you get people to pay for public radio? The answer is, of course, pledge drives, but in a more specific sense, it's offering certain kinds of incentives, the free album if you sign up, offering a bumper sticker, encouraging you, haranguing you, using social pressure in that kind of a way. And so some combination of social pressure and little incentives and belonging to a group can encourage folks to make contributions to a public good. There are lots of volunteer efforts and contributions in everything. You think about, for example, fundraising for colleges and universities largely happens on that model. Discouraging littering often happens on sort of a social pressure model. Giving to the United Way is also a kind of social pressure that often happens within the workforce. And these have a broadly similar structure. You're trying to overcome the free rider problem with a mixture of public recognition and little gifts and incentives for those who do contribute, and maybe some form of shaming, really, at least in a mild way, for those who don't contribute. Moreover, when people are in a repeat play situation where they know that they'll face the equivalent of this prisoner's dilemma game over and over again, they often pressure themselves to find a way to cooperate. But of course, at a big level, government and taxes are one way for society to decide that certain goods are going to be provided and everyone is going to pay for them, whether they wish to purchase a particular amount of that particular good or not. Now, in passing, I should point out that just because the government decides to finance a particular public good, the government doesn't need to produce that public good directly. For example, the government might decide to finance the building of roads, but it could hire private companies to actually build the roads. The government could, in theory, decide to finance public education, but hire private teachers in order to provide that education. So I don't want to argue that necessarily that's the way to reform education or anything like that. I just want to emphasize that when society comes together to do something through the government, I'm really talking about collecting the money to pay for it and leaving open the question of whether that good would be provided by public workers or paid for by the private sector to provide. Now, in a way, of course, government collecting taxes and buying public goods overcomes the free rider problem by brute force. If you don't pay your taxes for the public good, you go to jail. But a gentler way to put the same point, perhaps, is that people are not individuals, just individuals. They are members of a society. And when you're a member of society, you face certain benefits, you face certain costs. We can think of these benefits and costs of being a citizen as part of an implicit social contract. And part of the contract is that even when we disagree with the results of the democratic process, we attempt to change the outcome through political means. If I think not enough is being spent on police or not enough is being spent on schools, then I go and try and change that through the political process, not through defiance or revolution. From an economics viewpoint, the key lesson here is that if people don't find a way to come together, either through political mechanisms or through social mechanisms to provide public goods, you can end up in situations that few or none of us would actually prefer to be in. And in this particular case, the extraordinary power of individuals and firms following their own interests in a market economy is not going to help us. It will not produce the things that people want to see produced. There's a reasonably strong case that positive externalities do exist in many areas, involving the creation and dissemination of new information, research and development, scientific research, and K-12 education. Those are all areas where, if we don't find ways to come together as a society and pay for those public goods, we can all end up worse off than if we all follow our own self-interest.